I think a few of you were I think a few of you were on our virtual press conference. This is going to be a pretty similar presentation, but we also have some takeaways for advocates and also a very brief sort of user guide for the new website and data portal. So thank you again for this opportunity to present, Francisco. I'm going to be talking about a report called A Civil Injustice, the State of Eviction in California, 2010 to 2024. This is a collaboration between SAGE and the Housing Now Coalition. And yeah, let's get started. So, in California, eviction is a driving cause of homelessness and a frequent target of homelessness prevention policies. Right? But the counties with the most eviction filings report the least amount of eviction data to the state's judicial council. And this invites two questions. The first is, why are lawmakers crafting eviction prevention policies without fully understanding eviction data? And then, second, how do they know if these policy interventions are working? And so before we dive into the report, let's just talk really briefly about what do we mean by eviction data. So eviction data refers to two things, at least in this report. The first is data on eviction filings, which is basically how many unlawful detainer lawsuits have landlords filed against tenants. And the second is data on eviction outcomes. So what actually happened in those lawsuits. And this is important because eviction data illuminates a few things. So first, it helps us answer the question of how many eviction lawsuits are being filed across California. What are the outcomes of these filed lawsuits? And are there any trends in eviction outcomes over time? So now that we've talked a little bit about what eviction data is and the questions that it can answer, where does it come from? So in California, all eviction data originates in superior courthouses where landlords file eviction cases and tenants defend themselves against them. The superior courthouses then send their data to the county superior court system. At this point, the county superior court system might share this data with a partner if they're in a data sharing partnership. A good example of this is Stanford University in the Bay Area and also in Los Angeles, or they will share this data with the Judicial Council of California, who then publish it in external reports or provide it through California Public Records Act requests, and anybody can make those requests. So this report analyzes data. It's a pretty large data set on statewide eviction outcomes. So it's 14 years of data on eviction filings and outcomes, 27 outcome categories that are tracked by Judicial Council, 58 county superior court systems, 815,612 eviction cases with outcomes, and 1,703,726 eviction filings. So the first part of this report is talking about eviction data coverage in California. So we'll start with the good. So 100% of counties now report data on eviction filings. They simply tell you how many cases were filed in those counties. And now 86% of counties report data on eviction outcomes. Okay, this sounds great. But now the bad. The 8 counties that don't report data on outcomes account for more than 54% of California's tenancies. These counties include Los Angeles, Riverside, Sacramento, and San Diego. And this is where it gets a little bit ugly, because these 8 counties account for over 57% of the state's eviction filings. Most of these counties have acute affordability and homelessness crises, and on top of that, recent legislative efforts to fix this situation have all stalled. So today we're going to focus on 3 eviction outcomes featured in the report. And the graphic to the right is a flowchart that's actually featured in the report. So we're going to be talking about defaults, dismissals, and trials. So default typically refers to a litigant's failure to fulfill some sort of court-ordered obligation. In eviction cases, this can happen at 2 points in time. First, a tenant might default at time 1 for failing to answer the landlord's summons and complaint within the court-mandated 10 days. Default can also happen at a second period of time throughout an eviction lawsuit when a tenant fails to appear for any kind of court-mandated appearance. So one thing that we found is that over 46% of all eviction outcomes were defaults, and over 96% of defaults occurred at this point in time 1. And what this means is that almost half of eviction lawsuits in California are resolved before tenants even get the opportunity to defend themselves in court. And this is basically happening over a paperwork error. So the second most frequent outcome that we found in all of this eviction data was case dismissals. And it's important to note here that a dismissal can happen at any point over the life of an eviction lawsuit, but there's only 2 parties that can dismiss an eviction lawsuit: landlords, who are the plaintiffs, and courts are also able to unilaterally dismiss cases with prejudice, which means that a landlord can't file that case over again, and without prejudice, which means that they can. Now, one of the things that we found is that over 66% of dismissals occur during what we refer to as hallway negotiations. So in an eviction lawsuit, the courts will do roll call, and then usually the judge or the commissioner will invite parties to go out into the hallway and try to negotiate a settlement. Right? So these cases don't go to trial. We found that 66% of these dismissals occur during hallway negotiations. We also found that that dismissals increased dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we identified a trend that's actually that's pretty disturbing. So in places with high levels of default, there are low levels of dismissals. And in places with low levels of defaults, there are high levels of dismissals. And what this suggests to us is that when a tenant avoids default, there is a high likelihood that a landlord will dismiss the case. And what this suggests to us is that a lot of the evictions that are moving through our court systems are not particularly, they lack the grounds that they need to actually move through the court system. And we'll talk a little bit about the policy implications of that in a bit. But what we're finding is that when tenants avoid default and they go to court, landlords are extremely likely to settle cases. And then finally, when we talk about eviction in the legal system in California, we hear a lot, particularly from our opposition, about trials, and particularly about how trials have flooded the court system. Every tenant is trying to get a jury trial. There's simply too many trials, not enough courtrooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found actually is the complete opposite. Under 11% of outcomes were resolved at trial, right? And so there's 2 types of trials in eviction lawsuits. The first is bench trials. These are trials between the landlord plaintiff, the tenant defendant, and a judge, right? So there's no jury. And almost 100% of eviction cases that are resolved with a trial judgment are happening through bench trials. And just 0.2% of cases are resolved with a jury verdict. And what that means is that over 14 years in our data set, there were just 162 jury verdicts. Now, the reason I have an asterisk here is that it's entirely possible that the counties that don't report data on eviction outcomes have a lot more jury verdicts. But of course, we can't know because we simply don't have access to that data. So what are the sort of big picture takeaways from our report? So we think that this report paints a picture of procedural injustice. And what I mean by that is that almost half of tenants are losing their homes through default judgments. And again, that means that almost half of tenants are losing their homes before their first court date. They never have the opportunity to defend themselves. We also know that 2/3 of dismissals are occurring during hallway negotiations. So when tenants do have the opportunity to defend themselves, and they do come to court, landlords are more likely to dismiss these lawsuits. And it just makes us wonder, well, are all of these cases legitimate? And is there any way that we can sort of weed out the illegitimate eviction cases and really help tenants avoid this process in the first place? And then finally, trials are rare, and jury trials are virtually non-existent. And this is a big problem, in part because litigants in California, especially in civil litigation, have the right to a jury trial. And again, it's possible that the distribution of outcomes looks different in counties that don't report complete data, but this is kind of the problem. We simply don't know. So what's our policy path forward? So I guess first we can enact SB 1160, the Eviction Court Data Transparency Act. And I guess this can also serve as a brief campaign update. We were voted out of the Senate, 38-0. Now we're heading to Assembly policy committees. And thanks to many of you in this room, we have 65 organizations from across the state in support of our legislation. So we can also expand access to procedural justice to mitigate civil injustice, right? We have to make sure that tenants have access to the legal process to defend themselves, right? Or else, like everything else that we're doing can be undermined just because of this process. We also need to encourage equitable outcomes outside of the courtroom, right? And this can look like a lot of different things, and I'm happy to talk with folks about this afterwards if there's questions. And then finally, we can embrace a truly data-driven homelessness prevention policy. And if anything, this report shows that we simply have not done any of that. We are facing homelessness crises, housing affordability crises across our state, and we don't have data on one of the primary causes of homelessness. So what are some lessons that our report has for advocates across California? So the first thing is that data is really powerful in advocacy campaigns. When we first started doing our tenant protection policy work in California, and I moved here in 2013, we didn't have any data on the number of eviction filings. We didn't know about trends over time, and we definitely didn't know anything about outcomes. So a lot of the policies that were being created, especially to address homelessness and homelessness prevention in Los Angeles, were done without any sort of data that told us about the size of the problem, right? The quantification. It didn't really tell us anything about where evictions were happening and what the outcomes of that process were, right? Illumination. And then we didn't have the data that we needed to really make the case for why our advocacy campaigns were necessary. And we couldn't answer really important questions that elected officials and folks in government agencies were asking from us, right? And that's substantiation. So this kind of data can also enable more opportunities for inter-county, regional, and cross-sector collaboration. And we've already started to do that through collaborations with Health and Partnership and the California Budget and Policy Center, right? Being able to see that these problems are not just limited to individual counties, but are actually problems in entire regions, can allow us to create homelessness prevention policies that actually address the root causes in the places where people are not only becoming homeless, but people are getting pushed out into. Also gives us a powerful case for funding both legal services and tenant advocacy to prevent homelessness. Right? The only way to prevent default, this might be an unpopular comment in this room, but lawyers cannot really help prevent default, right? Tenant advocates can prevent default. They can do outreach and awareness. They can create tools like the Tenant Power Toolkit. They can really work with tenants to make sure that they are able to file answers and participate in this legal process through which they might become homeless, right? And the other thing is that anybody can do this, right? I started doing this when I was a grad student in 2013, which is send an email every single year to Judicial Council and ask them for updated data on outcomes, right? But institutional support doesn't hurt either, right? Now the LA Superior Court publishes data on eviction filings, which is a huge help to those of us, down south. But we also get, information every once in a while from these data sharing partnerships, like the ones that Stanford University has done with the LA courts and the Bay Area courts, that really kind of give us insight that we didn't have before into, how evictions are being processed and what the outcomes are. So as part of this report, we also created a data portal because we felt really strongly about the fact that we wanted this to be a tool for advocates across the state. So right now I'm going to give you a brief sort of user guide into our data portal, which is located at civilinjustice.net. So this is right now on my screen. You can see what the front page of this portal looks like. You can also see that I have not updated Chrome yet. The data portal is organized into a few different sections, which I'll describe now. The report data, appendixes, pipeline, and demands. So the first thing that you can find in our data portal is the report itself. And in the report you can find the things that I reported on today, but also a lot of other insights about eviction filings over this 14-year period of time throughout California. And these images just kind of give you a sense of what that content looks like in the report. In the report, you'll also find access to all of the data in the report. And this data is presented in tables, but you can also download the CSV files if you want to take a look at it for yourself. Right? But we wanted this to be really transparent and also publicly accessible to the advocates who need it the most. Now, one of the things you'll also find in here is a series of appendices, right? And the appendices talk about a few different things. So the first thing that you can find is averages over this period of time from all counties. So for example, you can find out exactly like what is the 13-year average of eviction filings in Riverside, and what percentage of cases over this period of time were resolved through a bench trial. So you can do this for all 58 counties in California. As you'll see, some of the counties don't report data, and for those counties, we're very clear that there's just no data provided on certain certain important outcomes throughout the process. Now, like I was saying before, and this arrow is pointing towards a button that says CSV, because you can click on download the CSV and you can get all of the report data in CSV format. So that is both the tables that are based on period averages, but it's also data from what we're calling our eviction county atlas, which is individualized, is all of the data that we used in the report for each of the 58 counties in California. And so we wanted this data to be available to advocates so they would be able to use it in their campaigns. Or, in some cases, if there is no data, be able to show that to, show that to policymakers and show that there is a clear need for, this data to be produced and released. So there's also a series of policy recommendations and policy demands. So you can take a look at those, and you can also take action. And if you click this button that says Take Action, it will take you to a Google form that a lot of you have already filled out, where you're able to express your support for the Eviction Court Data Transparency Act by signing on to our NASCAR letter. So thank you very much, everyone. This is available at civilinjustice.net. Thank you to SAGE. Thank you to the Housing Now Coalition. Thank you to the Action Lab, as well as Senator Durazo for supporting Senate Bill 1160, and our co-sponsors at the Western Center and What We All Deserve. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kyle. Adrian had a question in the chat about whether that reporting of eviction filings was voluntary or whether there was some kind of statute already in the books.
So everything that I collected, Judicial Council was doing voluntarily. And one of the reasons why, we have the legislation, this is not the first time we've run this legislation. I think it's actually the fourth. One of the reasons why we've, had to run this legislation is that we want to compel them to produce more data. So first, we want them to produce all of the data on eviction filings and outcomes for all 58 counties. That's the bare minimum. And then, SB 1160, makes it so it would compel the courts to report data on eviction filings and outcomes for every zip code in California, because we believe that that is the most helpful way to give advocates the information that they need to really implement homelessness prevention policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyle. Isamar, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. All the information was so useful. You mentioned that this is the fourth time. Are there any lessons from the first few efforts that were done, or how have you seen this been progressing or moving, or is there just any areas of focus that other advocates can continue to support with or hone in on some more?
Yeah, I mean, we've learned a lot of lessons since we first did this. Namely, we've learned a lot about the data reporting systems that the courts use. We've learned about staffing and judicial council. We've learned about the workflow between local courts and state courts. We know a lot that we did not know before, and that's allowed us to to really to focus on the cost of this bill, because previous versions have actually passed the assembly and were vetoed by the governor, and costs were cited as the reason for that. And so, we were able to get the Legislative Analyst's Office to create an independent appropriations analysis, and that's gone a very long way for us in sort of pushing back against Judicial Council, who, for good reasons, doesn't want to have this added work on their plate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Kyle, if you could put the endorsement form for that bill in the chat, then folks can also support the bill there. I know we're at time, so I just wanted to turn it over. Thank you so much, Kyle. Really appreciate this. We will try and identify the recording